On behalf of the Family Office and Petuel Asset Management, I'm thrilled to host Bruce Mehlman on what we promise to be a stimulating discussion on the great acceleration of 2020 and on how the crises of the 2020s are bringing the future faster in technology, globalization, culture, and politics. There's a lot of ground to cover here, so we're going to focus more on the disruptions in technology and politics and their impact on the economy. But first, a bit of background on Bruce. With over 2 decades experience in public policy, business, and the law, Bruce helps leaders and organizations understand, anticipate, and navigate political risk. Bruce is a highly sought-after speaker and thinker on policy and political trends. His quarterly infographic analyses are consumed by tens of thousands of readers around the world. If you have not seen the infographic analyses, I highly recommend you read them for their deep insights. Bruce previously served as the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Technology Policy under President George W. Bush. He also worked as a senior leadership aide in the House of Representatives, General Counsel to a National Political Party Committee, and Policy Counsel to Cisco Systems. Bruce is going to walk us through highlights of his great acceleration presentation in the first 15 to 20 minutes of this webinar, and then we'll open up for Q&A. This is meant to be an interactive session for you, so please feel free to post your questions on the menu. Bruce, so happy to have you. Over to you.
Ani, thank you for such a gracious introduction, and good afternoon to all of you. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and I will open here just with my broad brush attempt to try to understand, with all of the things that have been happening around the world and the United States, what are they going to mean? The reason I call this the Great Acceleration is because my conclusion is that the events of 2020 will ultimately prove to be more accelerative than transformational. And they will tie the trends that have been defining the world yesterday, explaining what's happening today, and shaping what's going to happen tomorrow. So I'll walk through each of those: yesterday, today, and tomorrow, technology trends, geopolitical trends, and cultural trends. First and foremost, we wouldn't be having a virtual global webinar but for the changes of the last 3 decades, where everything became digitized, everything became networked, things were made mobile and influenced by social media. It's created amazing opportunities to innovate, to tap global capital, global markets, global talent, but it's also created a lot of challenges. Many feel there's not sufficient consumer protection, particularly privacy, on the internet, and many feel the digitally dominant players control too much. And heading into this year, we saw a tech clash. Policymakers in the United States and around the world trying to rein in Google and Facebook and Amazon. While that was happening, of course, our world was changing. 3 decades ago, in 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. All of the countries of the Soviet Union then joined the global economy in 1991. That's the same year India made reforms to also become more globalized. Only 2 years later, China did the same. And in that year, 1993, you also had the birth of the EU, followed 1 year after by the passage of NAFTA here in North America and the creation of the World Trade Organization. Again, huge opportunities to build global supply chains, to invest all around the world, but also challenges. Many in the West thought their jobs were outsourced to China and Mexico, and China had not become more liberalized as many expected when they joined the WTO. Under President Xi, they become more authoritarian. So we saw a second backlash, this time a backlash against globalization. You saw populist candidates run and win in places such as Brazil, Mexico, Donald Trump in the United States, Boris Johnson and the Brexiteers in the UK. Very disruptive. While that was happening, demographic change meaningfully changed the United States in particular. And along with civil rights movements, there were opportunities for far more diverse voices to be heard. We also saw a reshaping of the media from a trusted institution that informed to one where those who are conservative listen to Fox News, those who are liberal go to CNN or MSNBC. We aren't informed of facts, we are affirmed in what we already believe. And so here again, there's a backlash between those who think we need to have more progressive reforms sooner and those who think we've already had too many progressive reforms and they want to see everything slow down. Now, what you find as a product of that is that trust in institutions across America has eroded. If you compare where people told pollsters, public opinion measurers, how much trust they had in each institution, if you compare where they were in 1979 to where they are now, every institution except the military has seen a meaningful erosion of trust. It's not just the United States. Edelman has a global trust barometer. They measured across 26 countries. This was at the start of the year before the pandemic. And they found that of the average trust in government was just below half. And that in 17 markets, there was net distrust of government. So when you don't have trusted institutions, but the world is changing and making you feel disrupted, what happens is the disruption arrives in politics. America has federal elections every 2 years. And in the 10 federal elections between 1960 and 1978, 3 of them saw voters change the party controlling the House, the Senate, and or the White House. You had 10 more federal elections between 1980 and 1998. And of those 10, 4 were change elections. In this century, we've had 10 more federal elections in the United States. And of these 10, 8 were change elections. For those whose theory is everything is explained by Donald Trump, politically, he didn't arrive until 2016. He's more of a symptom than a cause. As we've seen, this is happening all around the world, not just in the United States. What I believe is driving voters to seek change and pushing this populism is the sense that the policies and institutions of the last century aren't making people feel protected against the realities of the new century. People feel fragile, and that's only going to be worse when you think about this year and the events of this year. With respect to the pandemics, anybody who's been reading Time magazine for the last 20 years should remember many of the covers where they talk about the risks. Why will we be wearing masks again? Why we're not ready for the next pandemic? That's a failure by policymakers who were warned. Likewise, we've seen big gaps in our social safety net, from the income inequality leaving half of American families without adequate resources, to the Americans without health insurance who are more likely to have pre-existing conditions that make COVID worse, to those who can't work from home or their kids can't learn from home because they don't have home broadband. And with respect to social justice, again, a major gap in income and wealth between white and African American households. Similarly, if you are Black in America, you're more than 4 times as likely to be killed by the police when unarmed in an encounter with them. You're more likely as well to be in jail. That's the disruptive world prior to the year of 2020. So where are we this year? And again, I'll walk through technological trends, geopolitical trends, and cultural trends. Technologically, one of the things that we see is that the digitized are thriving. In the stock market, the IT companies within the S&P 500, they're up 32% for the year. The rest of the companies, other than the IT companies in the S&P 500, are flat for the year. You've seen extraordinary success from those who are well-positioned and ready for a more digitized world. You have companies like Zoom that are now verbs. At the same time, the undigitized fail. American schools had never planned for remote learning and remote teaching, and they're not good at it yet. We had a lot of barriers in place for telehealth. That's going to be a revolutionary change going forward, but we shouldn't have started as far behind as we did. And our government didn't have plans. Congress had no plan in place to work remotely in event of a national emergency, which is inexcusable. And their big solution to that is they call it proxy voting, people calling other people to vote for them. What we're seeing, though, as the Microsoft CEO pointed out, is we're seeing decades of change now happening in months. And this hyper-digitization, every company becoming more focused on the cloud, more focused on cyber, more focused on digital delivery, that's going to continue. Geopolitically, there are some examples of global cooperation, far too few. But the COVAX vaccine sharing and distribution partnership is promising. It's good that China recently joined it. I think it's distressing that America has still not joined it due to President Trump's anger at the World Health Organization. I'm hoping we will join it when it becomes something that can have a positive effect. At the same time, both the United States and China have seen meaningful erosion in public favorability, public trust. In the last decade, since 2010, public favorability as measured by Pew is down 45% for the United States and down 49% for China. The U.S.-China friction, the decoupling that folks are seeing is not merely an election year event. It's going to continue, whether it's a Republican or Democrat in the White House next year. The next decade or two is going to be very much defined by the competition for global leadership between America and China. Culturally, what we're seeing is more Americans than ever are voting. The highest number in 104 years voted in our 2018 midterm elections. In 2020, we're going to see the highest percentage of eligible voters vote in more than 100 years, since 1908. We're also in this world of detached realities. So where do you get your news? If you only watch Fox News and only listen to conservative talk radio, then when the pollster asks you the question, do you think the U.S. government, USG, did everything it could to prevent COVID spread, 90% of you said yes. But if your only news is from MSNBC or CNN or NPR radio, only 3% of you think yes. We're heading into this election with different beliefs in what reality is. We're also at a time where BLM stands for Black Lives Matter. There is broader agreement about the need for businesses to step up and to try to deal with these social policy challenges and issues than they've ever had before. As for those issues that define this year in such a unique way, we find them divided. So start with the economy. When you look at the last 3 recessions, and you compare the income change for the top 25% and the bottom 25%, they've been pretty close. This year, it's what they call a K-shaped recovery. Radical difference between the top 25% of income earners who are able to work remotely and whose income is slightly up since the start of the year, and those who can't work remotely and whose income is significantly down. Similarly, in America, we are fighting over statues of former Confederate generals, whether to take them down. But the true social injustice is the fact that African Americans are more likely, and Latinos, so Americans of color, are more likely to have COVID. They're more likely to die from it. They're more likely to have lost their job. They're less likely to have their children able to learn in school. Certainly, it's redefined the presidential election, the events of this year have, which is going to be decided in 3 areas. First, did the president do a good job with the pandemic? He looks like a wartime leader, but it doesn't feel like we're winning the war. And overall, voters asked about how he is handling the pandemic find him insufficient, find him wanting. But the next question some voters ask is, well, what about the recovery and the recession, and who's going to have better tax policies or regulatory policies? Who's got better policies for growth? In this regard, voters consistently think Donald Trump has better economic policies than Joe Biden might. So that's some hope for the president. The last question is, who do Americans think is the right leader for tomorrow? And here, each campaign is attacking the other. So what the Trump campaign says is that you won't be safe in Joe Biden's America. Trump says Biden is too weak, that he's too woke, which means politically correct, that he's been in Washington for 44 years. That's too long. The Biden campaign says that Donald Trump is failing America. Biden says Trump is too divisive, he's too chaotic, he's too corrupt. Last century, I might have said what matters is who the voters like more. Now it's who the voters dislike less. And in the 2016 elections, the voters who did not like Hillary Clinton and did not like Donald Trump picked Donald Trump by 17 points. Right now, the voters who don't like Joe Biden and don't like Donald Trump picked Joe Biden by 15 points. So that's where we've been. That's where that's where we are. Now, here's where we're going. And it's actually, I'm only going to offer 7 because I promised Tani I'd be under 20 minutes. 7 trends. First, the 4th industrial revolution is accelerating. The use of digital technologies, of sensors, of artificial intelligence that was already moving quickly is moving that much more quickly. The companies, part of the reason that the IT companies have been so successful is that they are both the best at using the product, but they're also selling these products. I'm actually optimistic that 20 years from now, when we read about this period in time, there'll be a bright, positive story about all of these amazing innovations that make us more productive, that make us more innovative, that make us healthier, that were happening This year, we just don't notice them. Number two, within that, there's going to be the birth and acceleration of a resilience economy. So there's a lot of money going to be invested in how do we better prepare for future pandemics, promoting public health. Obviously, we have huge challenges. The climate is only becoming more of a challenge. And just as we failed to prepare for that one, there are going to be a lot stronger voices saying we need to prepare for these climate challenges in the way that we haven't been. More of us are online than ever. More systems are digital than ever. There's greater attack surfaces in cyber. Active cyber defenses are going to create extraordinary needs and opportunities. And America's infrastructure and many around the world are inadequate, they're old, and they're failing. But rather than just rebuilding or repairing, it's going to be built back smarter. Number three, the pushback against these digitally data-dominant companies, the Amazons, the Googles, the Facebooks. It's not just the United States. The EU really has been the leader. It's not just Republicans, it's Republicans and Democrats. It's states such as California. And as one thinks of those businesses, and I trust Hani and the team at Family Office far more than myself to know what stocks are well valued or overvalued or undervalued. Their challenges, I think, are first, they're very highly valued. Is it a smart investment given their current prices? But the other challenge is that policymakers are looking to re-examine antitrust, to maybe break them up. I think this week we're going to see an effort by the Trump Justice Department to break up Google. But it's happening all around the world, and they're asking questions about whether they should be required to do more censorship or in trouble for censoring too much. Same with privacy, same with questions of national security. Number four, the world order that had existed had been based upon the Cold War that's over. The New World Order is based upon this return of a great power rivalry between, this time, the United States and China. We're going to see with their Belt and Road Initiative, with their lending initiatives, with their efforts to be helpful, whether it's on climate or infrastructure, China really trying to have its own sphere of influence. But we're also overdue to rethink many of the multilateral institutions that had been built for a Cold War that's long over. We're still going to have, of course, globalization, but the accelerating pace, the pace of acceleration of cross-border data and goods and people and capital knowledge, that flow is going to slow down. And we have disrupted and will continue to disrupt the economics of trade. And whether this is because of new technologies such as fracking, or because of automation of work that used to be outsourced from the United States and with products re-imported, they are now going to be made in things such as 3D manufacturing. Likewise, all around the world, we're seeing nationalists rise, and the nationalists are looking to impose tariffs or export controls to stop foreign technology, and they're looking for domestic subsidies to attract domestic investments. Number 5 of 7, what had been a tailwind of helping the growth of economies, your GDP, your economic growth equals the size of your workforce times its productivity. And if you want to grow your output, you can either have a bigger workforce or greater productivity. In the green there, the last 3 decades, almost all of the major economies, with the meaningful exception of Japan, saw their economies grow. But over the next 3 decades, almost all of the major current economies are going to see their workforce shrink. India is an exception, and that's going to have a big impact on how societies operate, on how they afford social safety nets, on what their priorities and needs are. I don't know why I was stuck there. Sorry about that. Number 6 of 7. We're seeing change in mindset and change in prioritization. So before COVID, it was a focus on efficiency, just in time. That's giving way to a focus on resilience, just in case. For governments, they're going to fund stockpiles, excess capacity, readiness SIP programs. For businesses, they're not moving all supply chains to the United States from China, but they're moving them out of China. So are Japanese companies, so are Australian companies. We're redesigning not only office space, but the expectations of how often people come into the office. And individuals are reconsidering whether they want to live in cities and whether they want to take public transportation. Number 2, the focus on interdependence is giving way to a focus on self-sufficiency. We used to talk about a defense industrial base that now includes 5G, that includes semiconductors, It's going to include pharmaceuticals. It's going to include protective equipment. The barriers to migration, which were put up during COVID, will come down, but there will be new barriers still with respect to public health. Businesses have switched their focus from global integration, being in more markets, to vertical integration, having more control over their own supply chains. Many of us are cooking, working, and schooling at home, and while I can't wait to go back to restaurants, a lot of these changes will stick because some things we're doing on our own are cheaper and work better. The massive appetite for leverage and risk is giving way to a focus on margin and safety, especially as the disease continues and as the economy struggles. For government, after the 9/11 attacks in America, there were new laws on transportation security and cargo security. After the financial collapse, there were new rules around banking and systemic risk. We're going to see new regulations on public health and larger safety nets. Businesses looking at new liability risks, the need to have more liquidity. Individuals are looking at bigger employers and maybe renting rather than owning real estate. Finally, the mindset of abundance is giving way and will even be worse if this persists long to one of austerity. For business, for government, they will soon, it's good that they spent as much as they did early on, and I think we have one more fiscal stimulus in us as a nation, but somewhere next year or the year after, they're going to look to cut spending, and they're going to look to raise taxes in the event of a Joe Biden presidency immediately. There's also an interest in having for businesses deeper reserves. There'll be a little bit of caution about paying dividends and doing share buybacks. Individuals, as we saw in the Great Depression, if you're out of a job for a long period of time, you're going to be much more cautious as a consumer, less likely to be an entrepreneur. So my last slide, this is a bit of an eye chart. I apologize, and I won't read everything on here, but obviously who wins this election matters a lot. The potential for a Biden administration policies contrast sharply in areas such as immigration, and climate, and labor, less so in areas such as dealing with big tech or infrastructure or how we perhaps confront China. This is these are the short-term big policy changes. Long-term, we're looking at an era of significant reform. This next decade across America are going to see major policy reforms, both led by Republicans and by Democrats. There'll be a lot of domestic fighting, but huge impacts on markets and huge impact for geopolitics. Hani, by my clock, it's exactly 20 minutes, maybe 2 seconds less, so I'm a man of my word.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was terrific, very enriching, and very deep and full of insights. Much appreciated. We're going to open up for Q&A, and we're getting some questions here. So if you can please enter your questions into the Q&A inbox where you have it in front of you. I'm going to start with my question first. Bruce, you covered a lot of ground in your presentation. I think what's hard to miss here is you being a Washington insider and looking at this in the prism over the last 20 years of your experience. You hit on something really important, which is this leadership and leadership issue and this issue of trust. What are institutions failing to do here? What can be done in order to rebuild that trust? Perhaps you can shed some light on that first.
Well, I wish I could tell you there's a simple 3-point plan based upon just looking at American history. I think what you need is you need to be more responsive to the challenges that people are facing every day. And as we saw at the turn of the 20th century, the 1900s, the 1800s became the 1900s, so-called Gilded Age in America. We had institutions that weren't well designed for the new realities of the world. And as a result of that, you saw a loss of trust. They reinvented the policies. They reinvented the institutions. It's as whether you're a business, whether you're an investment firm, building that trust takes decades of consistency, of transparency, of reliability. And of course, it can be blown up pretty quickly if you mess up. So I'm hopeful in the medium term, because I do think America has reached a point now where we are reconsidering a lot of these institutions and what they mean and how they're going to impact somebody was clicking ahead. I think they were looking for that.
Yes,
I think, I think, sorry, it's a lot of clicks. I think that will happen, but it's the challenge is, and this is one of the truths Donald Trump recognized, and part of the reason he got elected is because against Hillary Clinton, who was generally acting like, that you could trust the big global elite institutions. And a lot of Americans don't trust the big global elite institutions. They feel like they let them down. And that, and when she used that phrase, deplorables, a lot of Americans, the 40% who are white and haven't gone to college, thought she was talking about them. And so, if you want to regain the trust as an institution, first you need to actually listen to people. Then you need to make them feel like you're listening to them, and then you need to be responsive to them. And for a lot of American institutions, and frankly, for the way the global economy has been wired, you can be wildly successful. You can go to Davos, and everyone in Davos who's powerful and famous and wealthy are going to agree that we're all humanitarians. But if you don't have the so-called consent of the governed, if you don't have the people whose trust you want feeling like they're part of your thinking, they're not going to trust you. And it was and remains an absence. It's a little bit why you're seeing things like the Business Roundtable CEOs restating the purpose of a corporation to be more than just shareholders, but to also to think about all of their stakeholders, including shareholders.
Thank you. And because we can't resist, we're 2 weeks away tomorrow, Trump or Biden, Bruce.
So if I had to bet my life, as in I die if I'm wrong, I will definitely bet on Biden. He is the current favorite. If you told me I had to invest $1, I wouldn't invest all of my dollar with Biden. I'd want to hedge that bet. The polling all shows Joe Biden ahead. Of course, it showed Hillary Clinton ahead, but if the polling is wrong this time, it will be the biggest failure ever in American polling. Last time it was a big failure, but not as big as some other failures, number one. Number two, they corrected for a lot of that. Number three, it's Donald Trump as president hasn't expanded the potential for voters who would support him. He's kind of doubled down and tripled down on appealing to his pretty narrow, albeit very intensely supportive part of the electorate. That said, even though he is stuck around 44% approval, 45% of the electorate at tops say they vote for him, more than 50%, 51% of the electorate approves of the job he's doing on the economy. So in my mind, his potential could actually get up there, but he's not run in my opinion, a sophisticated campaign that tries to be any different than he was 4 years ago. But unlike 4 years ago, he's got his own record that starts with a pandemic, and that's not a good record. So if you have to bet against him, but don't bet every dollar you got against him, find a way to hedge that bet.
Thank you for that clear response. If I can shift a little bit, we're getting some questions here, and one of the questions was on the disruption and public health and the addition of technological disruption. Walk us through what you're seeing is changing and what could change in the future.
So it's a great question, and there's a little bit of a challenge of there's public health globally, and then there is public health in the American context where we're wonderfully innovative, but we spend more per GDP than any other country without having longer lifespans. We're more innovative, and it's easier to get to new therapeutics, or it's easier for me to get there, but that's in part because I can afford top-of-the-line healthcare. American top-of-the-line healthcare is the best in the world. I'm not sure if our average is, and I know at the bottom we're not. That said, as I think of changes, I think there's a host of them. We're going to see we're going to see permanent allowance of telehealth and a lot more investment in telehealth. It's going to make it a lot better. We're already seeing things like wearables. I've got Fitbit here. The NBA players had something called an Oura Ring. But we're already seeing a lot more investment in development and deployment of wearables that have the new Apple Watch has a pulse oximeter to measure how much oxygen you have. Part of the reason that they rushed that out is because it's actually helpful in the COVID world. So home health technology, home health service taking advantage of wearables, taking advantage of the cloud, taking advantage of telehealth. That's all for sure on the rise, and I think you're going to see practitioners and hospitals find ways to leverage that more successfully. There is an extraordinary amount of money that's going into vaccines and to rapid prototyping and leveraging AI to assess therapeutics and vaccines. That doesn't all go away once COVID, they come up with a vaccine or 10 on COVID, that would be wonderful. But a whole lot of how public health prepares for and responds to leveraging technological tools, responds to the new diseases and new risks, for that matter, old diseases. These are massive changes of billions of dollars investment, and they're not going to go away. So I'm very hopeful that in the 5 to 20 year window, technology will very much ride to the rescue for our ability to be healthier, to live healthier lives, to have better monitoring of our health real time, to have better interactions with our medical professionals. And the only piece that I haven't solved for in that soliloquy is America and our costs. I don't know exactly how we're going to get our arms around what is an excessively expensive health system, let alone one that is unequal as ours is.
Thank you. And just touching on that at the tail end, we talked about vaccines. Do you see that as something that will become compulsory? Is that going to be an issue in the United States as it might be in other countries?
No, we don't do compulsory much very well. America has always long had that the dual challenges of collective good versus individual freedom. And we've been super strong on the individual freedom side, contrast, say, with China. I mean, China's brilliantly managed, if they're to be believed, they brilliantly managed the pandemic. But part of it is because they're an authoritarian nation, so there isn't freedom. So if they say you're going to be monitored, you're going to be monitored. They say you're going to take a vaccine, you take a vaccine. In America, even long-standing, proven safe vaccines like childhood vaccine, disease vaccines don't have 100% compliance, aren't compulsory, and there are a lot of fights about whether or not they should be a requirement if you want to send your child to public school, even though absence of that vaccine could make your child a greater health risk. This new vaccine, when it comes out, we've seen in polling a declining percent of Americans say they're ready and willing to take it. Some of that is maybe people fear COVID a little bit less than they feared COVID. Some of it is because if there's multiple new vaccines coming online, many folks, myself included, I believe in vaccines, I believe in science, but I'd like to know what's on the menu. What are my options? Can I take them all? Should I take them all? Am I only going to get to take one? Which is the right one for me? I may want to wait a little bit of time. Heck, we can't even make people wear masks. I mean, the security guards in the stores have been shot telling people you need to wear a mask to come in. So America doesn't do compulsory very well. It explains in part why we're also not doing so well vis-a-vis climate. That's going to be a challenge for the American economy and for American society, is the general unwillingness to take a vaccine. I'll be interested to see how Donald Trump, what he recommends. I think if he's reelected, he will push hard to have Americans trust and take vaccines. I think if he loses the election in 2 weeks and a day, he's going to come out and suggest he doesn't trust the vaccine. And I say that in part because prior to him becoming president, he was frequently retweeting anti-vax tweets. So that's going to be a mess, I fear, in the United States, probably driving a little bit more inequality again, where people who are more on the economic bottom are going to be less trusting and less likely to take a vaccine.
Fascinating. Switching gears a little bit, as a longtime resident of Hong Kong, and we're getting some questions as well on this, what's your take on a Biden administration, China-U.S. relations? How do things change in a Biden world?
So whether it's President Trump or President Biden, the U.S.-China friction will definitely continue. It's one of the rare areas of bipartisan agreement. Republicans and Democrats both agree that China doesn't play by the rules, that the U.S. needs to stand up forcefully to China. So Democrats don't quite give Donald Trump credit for that, but they kind of do because they're there now as well. So you start with everyone agrees we need to be tougher. How we're tougher and what we're tougher about are the areas of difference. So, for example, Donald Trump, it's always been about economics and a lot less about human rights. He's never really expressed much concern about Uyghurs, though the Uyghur minority Muslim population in China, though, as he's looking for things to fight with China about, he's sometimes pulling that one out. But that hasn't really been a concern of his. I think Joe Biden would make that one of the leading areas of concern that you would have. Biden says he wants to have, he wants to stand shoulder to shoulder with allies, and so he wants a more unified front towards China, as opposed to Donald Trump, who takes a bit more of an America first approach to China, where Donald Trump's also fighting Canada over aluminum. He's fighting Canada, who was fighting Canada over milk. He's fighting Germany over cars. I think Biden's theory on how to confront and contain China would be to bring the democracies of the West together in a more unified fashion, which look, that sounds right to me. However, I think it's easier said than done, because Barack Obama was fighting with the EU over Airbus versus Boeing, and Barack Obama and the EU couldn't agree on EU's efforts to regulate U.S. high-tech companies. Joe Biden becoming the president doesn't solve some of these questions about the desire of France and other European nations to tax the revenue as opposed to the profits of Amazon and Google. That's a fight that we don't agree on. So even though we have China as a mutual area of concern, it'll be interesting to see if Biden could succeed. He's going to try, though. And to be fair, President Trump didn't try so much. His approach more frequently was, you got to be with us because we're the biggest economy, and if you're not, we'll make you pay, which is a harder way to bring allies along. Although sometimes it's a way to force change and to drive. When people in the world or the region know that you're going to be that intense and dogmatic, they may re-envision. I think some of, although I'm not an expert in this area as much as I suspect many on the call, but it feels like some of the success on the Israel-Bahrain and Israel-UAE Abraham Accords has been the Trump approach to Iran has led to many in the region concluding they need to make their own adjustments to adjust for how the United States has approached that. I think the other thing with China is you could see efforts. Neither of these American presidents would want to go to war. I think you could see efforts by Biden administration to try to cool things down a little more overtly, perhaps looking for cooperation in areas such as climate, in areas such as the World Health Organization. And sometimes small steps like that, even though the economic area is fraught and the human rights area is fraught, you are a lot more likely to succeed if you can find some areas of commonality and some areas of cooperation.
Thank you for that illuminating response. One of your slides also, you discussed the resilience economy. I'm kind of curious about that, how you see that evolving with time and adapting given the current circumstance. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? And also, given your background in technology, what is that? How does that all tie in terms of disruption when you're looking forward 3, 4, 5 years?
Yeah, I think there is massive disruption that explained yesterday and is impacting today, but it's the technologically driven disruption is actually accelerating. And as noted, at least in these first two slides, I have a brief dose of optimism here in my presentation, but it tends to be around what technology should enable. There are plenty of techno-pessimists who would also tell you about ways in which gene editing could create new biological weapons or other bad things. But as I see, we're looking at massive public investment all around the world, as well as massive private investment in ways to do things smarter, in ways to leverage technology. So climate change, what do you do about climate change? Whether it's carbon capture, whether it's solar panel, electric vehicles, battery storage, whether it's a smarter grid so that, I forget what the statistic is, but you may lose 20% of power through transmission lines. It could be that you lose 20% of water in transmission lines, and it may be that you lose both 20% of power and 20% of water through leaky or otherwise old transmission lines. That would suggest that the easiest way to improve energy efficiency is to start by wasting less. And so there are a lot of efforts to think through what a smarter grid might look like, or what a sensor-based, better infrastructure for water dissemination. And there are, a lot of the private equity folks are looking at deploying billions all around the world precisely with those sorts of projects that are generally public-private partnerships in mind. Same with health, whether that's figuring out how to deploy, how to leverage the technological tools, whether that's AI looking at the cloud and social media, or whether that's and what people in America, when there is a flu epidemic, people are more likely in the area of the flu epidemic to be Googling flu symptoms or flu cures or therapeutics. And so as a result, there's a lot of knowledge that could be gained. And I know in the private sector, they often do spot these trends ahead of the official government statistics. I think government's going to invest a lot more in the sensors and the ability to see what's happening all around the world and to quickly try to basically track and trace what's going on. Cyber, I think, is self-evident. Folks know what that's about, but it's an underinvested area. I'm hoping that what I hope and believe is policymakers are going to recognize that COVID has been terrible. We got lucky that it wasn't deadly. How do we get in front of that? Climate is terrible and it's getting worse, and ignoring it or pretending it's not a thing is not smart. So how do we get better about that? On infrastructure, there are all of these both needs and promises, and infrastructure is also a way, if you want to have public investment in helping to get out of a recession. I mean, China, it's part of what China did that was so successful. You may have been over there then, Hani, is in the Great Recession in 08 and 09, where the U.S. was sending a lot of money to people to just have money to keep spending on things. China invested a whole lot of money in infrastructure, and that helped make them more productive. So it was not only short-term jobs, but it was long-term growth. And I think whether it's a Trump or a Biden administration, they both claim they're going to put trillions into infrastructure. The Biden team is 100% serious. They desperately want to do that. Trump, I think he believes that he wants to do it. We'll see how much more Republican appetite there is for debt and deficits. It's already, Republicans are okay with debt and deficits as long as it's driven by cutting taxes or Republicans in the White House. And I'm a Republican. When Democrats are in the White House, Republicans then become very upset about debt and deficits. And you're already starting to see people making noise, perhaps because they think Joe Biden's going to win, and then they want to act as if they're concerned about the fiscal situation. That's a counter trend that will make it more difficult to make the kind of smart infrastructure investments that I think will be there. A lot of folks, this better than I'm sure, given how great family office is, you're sharing a lot of these reports as you see them, but global trillions are going to go into this over the next decade.
Indeed. Bruce, one country you didn't mention, both in your presentation and in your comments, is Russia. Where do they fit into all this? What are your thoughts?
Should be careful. This is like, I know I poured this water myself. Look, I think Russia's got a lot of challenges. I think they've not been run in a way to focus well on the future. It's very much unlike many that I've seen and I admire and think are pretty fascinating in the Middle East, where so much revenue is derived for now, but they're making massive investments in trying to come up with alternatives, recognizing that the next century is not going to be as petro-dominated as the last century was. You've got to make those investments. Russia doesn't seem to be. It feels to me a lot that I can't quite figure out Vladimir Putin's end game. He seems very offended that the Soviet Union went away the way it did, and that Russia isn't seen on the global stage the way it used to be. And given their military might and nuclear powers and nuclear weapons, you can make a case militarily they're relevant, but he's not made the investments to make them economically relevant. Demographically, they're not necessarily moving in the right direction. And so I don't know what a post-Putin Russia would be or could be, but I don't see Russia on the upswing other than given their military might. You know, they've still got some years to run here. But if they were a stock, I might be thinking of them as a short-term stock. I would definitely not be thinking them as a buy and hold for 20 or 30 years because I just don't see the strategy.
Okay, short Russia. Perhaps we come to a close with that comment. We have a few more questions outstanding. I actually just want to touch on one thing before we wrap up, which is back to your comment about the technological disruptions that are happening and the tech backlash. If you can spend just a couple of minutes talking about what that could mean for business and for the economy as we move forward the next couple of years.
Happy to. This is where I probably spend certainly a lot more of my time than my knowledge of geopolitics. But the new commanding heights of the economy are data and computing power. And the Googles, the Amazons, the Apples, I think the Wall Street Journal just today had a story about how they are a greater share of the S&P 500's overall value than they've ever been. And I think more than any companies have ever been.
That's correct.
And when Amazon gets into a new business, like they bought Whole Foods Markets, which is a grocer, you saw the stocks of almost all the other grocers fall 10%. Even if they just say they're looking at something, they can have that kind of impact. They are dominant in many ways. Some of that is because they've been the smartest at leveraging technology, and technology enables businesses to be more productive and to be more competitive, and they just figured it out sooner. They also sell the tools to help other businesses kind of follow along. But the pushback comes on whether or not these dominant players are playing fairly. And I'd mentioned the parallels to the Gilded Age, America in the Gilded Age, at the turn of the 1900s. Back then, you had Standard Oil under Rockefeller, you had Vanderbilt, you had Carnegie, you had the billionaire captains of industry of their day, admired for building these extraordinary new businesses that leverage new technology. But America has a long-standing strain of being anti-dominant, anti-big. In the Gilded Age, they invented antitrust law in 1890 and in 1914. There were the two laws. And so they broke up Standard Oil, and policymakers came after them. You're seeing policymakers now. Recently in the House of Representatives, they just came out with a 450-page report why you need to break up the Amazons, the Googles, the Facebooks. They may have said Apple too. I don't think they wanted to break up Apple. But you've seen for almost a decade now, Vestager and the EU are likewise pushing against their on competition grounds, their dominance, on lack of consumer protection grounds. In the United States, in the United States, social media has many benefits, but it's also horrible places, just crazy things that are factually untrue, that are incredibly hostile and negative. And there are efforts to protect consumers by regulating that space better. There are concerns about whether these businesses pay their fair share in taxes and whether that needs to be changed. You've seen concerns about whether Lyft and Uber, we've seen these around the world, but certainly in California, they passed a new law suggesting that if you drive for Lyft and Uber, you're an employee. Even if you choose your own hours, you have your own car, you decide if you feel like working that day. I mean, all of these ways in which you seem independent, and Google and Lyft say you're independent, but the policymakers say, well, we need to protect these workers so they're not independent, which present existential threats for those businesses, frankly. For all of those reasons, these businesses face meaningful regulatory risk, meaningful legal risk, meaningful global risk. They're still, as the market is suggesting, smarter bets than coal companies and then companies that focus on, that don't have such great technologies. But if I were investing in these businesses in anything like the long term, I'd want to make sure I had thought through what I thought the regulatory risks were and how I might have early warnings about when I thought the risks that, remember IBM faced antitrust, a 12-year antitrust lawsuit in the 60s and the 70s. That's what allowed Microsoft to get born. Microsoft faced antitrust lawsuits in the late 90s, again from the Clinton administration. That's what gave Google the oxygen to grow. AT&T got broken up in the 1980s. I mean, America has a pretty long tradition of tech players becoming dominant and then having an antitrust effort slow them down, if not break them up. And that usually when they slow down, there's opportunity for new players to emerge.
Opportunities for new players to emerge. We'll end on that much more positive note. Bruce Mehlman, thank you so much for your thought-provoking and stimulating discussion and infographics. I look forward to our next webinar. Thank you so much for your time on behalf of both the Family Office and Petiole Asset Management.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And we'll end it here. Thanks all.